Hi folks, welcome back to Game Geeks. I'm your host Kurt Wiegel. Today we are reviewing the Hellfrost Land of Fire, which is a new campaign setting using Savage Worlds made by Triple Ace Games and the incredibly, frighteningly prolific pen of Wiggy. This is set in the same world as Hellfrost. So you've got the Hellfrost continent, Rassilon, which is the everything's freezing over and no one knows why and the gods of sun and fire have disappeared, etc., that we've reviewed several times before. It's a great sort of Viking, Germanic themed fantasy setting. And then there is a southern continent to that called Al-Shuruk. Now in Al-Shuruk, I think I'm mispronouncing that and I'm really sorry. You know how bad I am with pronunciations, everybody. This is very much an Arabian Nights Sinbad-themed fantasy setting. Now, I think this has been an undermined fantasy setting over the years. Most of what we get, honestly, is Tolkien-esque, England, Germanic, European, that sort of feel to it, whereas Rassilon has specifically focused on Viking, more Northern Germanic feel. Now we're into the Land of Fire, the Sinbad, the Aladdin, Arabian Nights sort of setting. I don't know why that has not been better mined. Maybe it's because you have the possibility of an accusation of racism from that. Maybe because there's a real culture in the world still sort of derived from that area. The whole Christian-Islamic discussion is inevitably filled with fraught and issue. So what you have in the Hellfrost Land of Fire very neatly sidesteps all of that. Very neatly sidesteps any potential controversy and gives you a very nicely coherent, separate, but still applicable to the Hellfrost world, this realm of, instead of eternal cold and eternal winter, is pretty much all the time hot, which is what you'd expect from a desert type setting. It requires the Hellfrost Player's Guide, mostly. The specific rules on magic, the way they get around PowerPoints, the siphoning, still, it doesn't reprint the siphoning rules as far as I could tell. You still need the Hellfrost Player's Guide for that to really understand it. You've got, well, to start with, when you make your characters, you've got your races. There are no elves and dwarves here. They need not apply. What you've got are separate races that have a very desert theme to it. You've got the Yakarli, which are jackalmen. They're the last remnants of an honorable, fairly advanced civilization that fell apart in the Great Jinn War. So now they are scattered, but they haven't devolved into barbarism or into nastiness. They're still a fairly honorable, high-minded species that just look like humanoid jackals. Humans, which come in two flavors, the Bedu, who are the nomadic desert wanderers, and the Hadri, which are city dwellers. You have the hyena men, sort of the opposite of the jackal men in that they're a bit more snarly, almost gnoll-like in their characteristics. The gin-blooded, who are people that just happen to have a certain amount of elemental background to them. And finally, you have the sand goblins, which used to have a civilization, and that's also fallen apart, and they're sort of shunned and looked down upon, but they're still available if you want your sort of smaller race that people can play with. Faith is a huge issue, as you can imagine, in the Land of Fire setting, and it all comes down to who Suleiman, who was a prophet or a messiah, who ended up being the person who freed humanity and all the other races, except for the Sphinxes, from the tyranny of the Jinn empires. There are two main philosophies that surround Suleiman. They're called the faithful and the devoted. For most of your characters, unless you're into an arcane background sort of character, it really doesn't matter that much. The two philosophies really separate on who Suleiman was and what is really going on in the universe. The faithful still believe in an old gods, polytheistic sort of, what you'd expect from a fantasy game, sort of philosophy. This is where your clerics, your true clerics and your paladin lie. And they believe that Suleiman was a man and he was a great thinker and he was a powerful wizard or priest, jury's still out, and was able to free humanity. But they still believe in the older gods. Then you have the devoted. That isn't really a religion as much as it is a dualistic philosophy, where there are really just two opposing powers in the universe, order and chaos, and most of the power comes from within or from the local area. Now, the devoted, that's where you get your magic or your sorceress types. And the sorcery here is broken up into 6 broad categories. The Jinn magic, which is essentially elementalism. Sand magic, which draws power from the desert itself, and the main limitation there, aside from the siphoning, is that you have to have a handful of sand or ash to do your power, which seems like a spell component limit until you realize you're in a deserty environment. There's a lot of that to play with. The dervish magic, which is sort of like the high magic from Hellfrost, where the people actually spin themselves up to begin to weave together, and they sometimes have to weave for multiple rounds, the strands of power to put together their spell. Interestingly, this uses agility as the basic attribute for the skill for dervish magic, which isn't something you see a lot, where it's a physical attribute. Most of the time, it's either smarts or spirit that determine the skill that you use. You've got the wiser, which I think is a derivation of vizier, who are the bodyguards and sort of, what's the word I'm looking for here, advisors to the nobles, and draw their power from the nobles themselves. The Ushbati, who animate objects and bring forth powers that are already inherent in objects. And finally, the Kemhaku, who are the necromancers, which sort of brings in a sort of Egyptian necromantic sort of feel to their kind of magic, which is generally feared. You've got a pretty nice batch of new hindrances and edges, most of them based on the society and the fact that you're living in a desert. Then there's detail, a very nice section, because what you usually don't get in most fantasy settings is, what do people do? What does the average person do in their day? What do they eat? What do they wear? What is marriage and sex and society and politics like? This really goes into a nice description for several pages on what that is for the Bedu and for the city dwellers of the Land of Fire setting. Beyond that, you get a nice little section on organizations and associations, how they fit into the society. The GM section has very good descriptions of the land itself, the different nations or areas, if you will, what life is like there, the cities, the civilizations, who rules, what's going on behind the scenes, the secret organizations, finally capping out with a pretty nice bestiary, with an extensive section saying there are other things from Hellfrost that you can use here. For example, the Baphomi, who are sort of the frog people, or the spirit skulls, how you can bring those in. What you get here is you get one book that is essentially the player's guide, bestiary, and gazetteer that you get for the 3 in the Hellfrost setting, mainly because there's a certain amount of go see this. It's assuming you have at least those 3 other books. But you don't need to. For example, you could easily populate your Land of Fire. If all you have is the Hellfrost Player's Guide, you don't really need the bestiary. You certainly don't need the gazetteer. But you really don't need the bestiary. Would help, but you don't absolutely need it to play in the Land of Fire setting. I have always had a soft spot for Arabian-style games. I never got into Al-Qadim. That came out late in college, early grad school for me, and for some reason I missed the boat on Al-Qadim, which I regret, because I think it's always been a neat idea for where you can set a game. This is a Savage Worlds game for all that means, which you know the system, and you know that I love the system if you've been watching the show for very long. You know that it has all the manipulatives like the bennies and shaken, the templates, wound levels, minis, so sort of you can use your minis in sort of a very broad tactical sense. This is an extraordinarily well-written, well-designed alternative fantasy setting that certainly has tie-ins to the Hellfrost, Evercold setting to it. You can certainly use that as, oh, hey, look, we're going south now. We're going south of the border, and look what we're doing down here. Don't wear as much fur or you'll die of heat stroke. And how some of like the Rim Wizards, who are the masters of eternal cold magic, how they work, because let's face it, you're in the middle of the desert where it's infernally hot, your ice magic probably isn't going to work too well. -10 to your roll, which is devastating in Savage Worlds. I really like Land of Fire. I've had a soft spot for Arabian fantasy for a long time. And now the fact that this is here and it uses an engine that I know and love really drives home how applicable the setting is. For Game Geeks, I'm your host, Kurt Wiegel. Good day and good gaming.